All right, so we have moved on to a new section. So everyone can like get out their celebration, their party hats. We moved on. We're off the Sermon on the Mount officially. So remember, this is the backstory. Jesus was in Capernaum. He'd done miracles. He was strong by the multitudes, like to the point where the Bible says that he was being crushed. Like literally, there were so many massive amounts of people there that were there. And I realized that I did not reconnect myself back up. So let me try this. How's this? This has got to be better. All right. Apologize. All right. So again, Jesus was in Capernaum, did lots of miracles, and the crowds were all around him. And then remember, he wanted to get away from them and go find a place to pray. So he heads up into the mountains, the mountain area. And it says that the people wanted him because he's a miracle worker. Like he's the magic man that's going to give them everything that they want. And so they want to know where he's at. Well, they follow, then his disciples finally figure out where he's at because he's gone, right? And they're trying to figure it out. So they eventually find him and the crowd follows him, which is where we wind up on the Sermon on the Mount. So remember the Sermon on the Mount, he's teaching to thousands and thousands of people up there, but particularly his disciples. He's just named them as the 12 apostles. We went through the Sermon on the Mount, which was Jesus's proper interpretation of the righteousness of the Mosaic law. And then after this time, this is the next event. So now the Sermon on the Mount is done. He's now going to come down off the mountain, and the next event happens. Now, for those of you that are a tad curious, remember, Luke is the one that gives us the right order of events, the right timeline of events. Matthew frequently will just move stuff around because of how it fits into his particular theme. So if you go and you continue on in Matthew, it's going to talk about the leper. Well, the leper, we already covered that a long time ago when we talked in Luke. So when you read Matthew, it'll look like it's the Sermon on the Mount, then it'll look like there's a leper. But in fact, that's the story we already covered a while ago. So Matthew interchanges that. So when we're looking at the order of events, we're going to look at Luke. So now Luke starts by telling us that the Sermon on the Mount has ended. And in fact, this next event that we have here, which is the healing of the centurion's servant, is going to occur. Now, it's been a while since we've looked at this map, because remember, we're in the part 4, which is the authority of the king. And, we've got a lot of stuff, right? We've got the authority of the king here, and then we're eventually going to get into the rejection of the king and things like that. So the life of Christ is going to move into these different phases. As of now, he's still establishing his authority as the promised Messiah of Israel. Eventually, Israel is going to reject him, and then we're going to get into different phases of his life, okay? But we're almost done with him establishing who he is as the king before we move on to our next section. And in this one, remember this section 16 that we had here that's in gray, that was the Messiah's authority to interpret the law. That was the Sermon on the Mount. That's where we spent, gosh, I don't know, 10 or 11 sessions just in this one section here. Now we're moving on to this one, and then we're going to finish that by his authority throughout the land of Israel, which we'll get to next week. And then we'll be on to our next section. All right. With that said as some background, Sermon on the Mount's done. Now, let's read the next event, which is the recognition of the authority of Jesus in Capernaum. And it's in 2 gospel accounts, Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 13, which again, Matthew chapter 8, verses 2 through 4, I believe is the story of the leper. That's why we're skipping and going to verse number 5. And then also in Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. So what I've done here is I've highlighted the parts in yellow are the parts that are different. And this is why actually reading the life of Christ in a not only chronological, but in a synoptic way, looking at all the gospel accounts side by side, you get a lot more. Because if you just read Matthew and then later on you read Luke, you might just think that it's the same exact thing. But in fact, when you put both of them together, you get more information. All right, so let's read Matthew and then we'll read Luke. and then I'll cover just some of the main differences, and then we'll get into the story. So Matthew chapter 8, verse 5, when he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly. And he said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion replied, Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from the east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And to the centurion, Jesus said, go, let it be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed at that very moment. All right. Now, in Matthew, we get this part about the Gentiles who are going to come and be part of the Messianic kingdom and actually banquet and dine with the patriarchs. Well, we have these Jewish people that have not put their faith in Christ that are going to end up in hell. Okay, that's in Matthew's only, not in Luke. Okay. We also have in Matthew that the servant was healed at that very moment. So the very moment that Jesus said that, I'll tell you, no one in Israel found such faith, basically at that moment, he's healed, right? So we get this a little extra part here from Matthew. Now, when we read Luke, verses 1 through 10, we have a few additional components of that. Verse 1 says, after he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people. Okay, now remember, this is Luke's account, and Luke chapter 6 is the what? It's the Sermon on the Mount. So after he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, so now he's done. He entered Capernaum. So he came down from whatever the mountainous sort of area, the hill country. It's more of a hill than it is mountain, but he came down and he entered Capernaum. Now, a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent him to the elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, he is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue. And Jesus went with them. When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore, I did not presume to come to you. But say the word and let my servant be healed. For I too am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turning to the crowd that followed him, said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the servant well. All right. So some different components that we have here that Luke records, not recorded in Matthew, is the timing, right? After he'd finished the Sermon on the Mount, okay? He also adds here, now in Matthew says that the servant was paralyzed and suffering terribly. So that's all that Matthew tells us, right? But he doesn't give any kind of an indication other than the fact that he's in pain, that there's anything immediately that needs to be done for his healing, right? Matthew doesn't do it. Now, Luke, being a what? What's his profession? Doctor. Tells us that he was sick and at the point of death. Okay, so now Luke tells us that not only is paralyzed and suffering, but he's close to dying. All right. He also says that this servant was highly valued by the centurion. Well, Matthew doesn't tell us that, right? He also says that, and this is something I'll address here in just a moment. In Matthew's account, the centurion is the one that comes to Jesus and asks him to heal his servant. And it appears as if Jesus is talking to the centurion. In Luke's account, the centurion doesn't go to Jesus at all. Centurion sends the elders of the synagogue to Jesus. They implore Jesus on behalf of the centurion, and Jesus tells the elders that he's healed. And then when they return, of course, he in fact is healed, right? So There's a little bit of controversy here. Is there a contradiction? Did Jesus go and talk to the centurion, or was it the elders that went and talked to the centurion? Okay, so there's a difference there. The other thing that we see is that these Jewish people pleaded earnestly with Jesus. And the word there, earnestly, is like they were fervently asking him. It wasn't just a favor. They didn't just say, okay, fine, I guess we'll go ask him. Like they were fervently imploring him to heal the servant of this Gentile, which is odd in itself, right? They also said that their reason for it, and we'll get into this here momentarily, is they provide the reason. Here's the reason why Jesus, you should do it. Now, we don't get the reason why Jesus should heal the servant in Matthew's account, but we do from Luke's account, okay? And Luke his gospel was written to whom? Gentiles, but specifically not Romans, the Greeks. The Greeks. So remember, Luke's focus, he's going to have a different focus than the other writers. The other writers, they all have their own focus, actually, but Luke's focus is on Gentiles, on women, and on humanity and the frailty of human beings, because he's a doctor. Okay, so he's going to be interested in a lot of things. So he includes some details here that for Matthew's audience, who did Matthew write to? The Jews, not of interest to them. So that's why we have some additional things here. But Luke gives the reasons why Jesus was asked to do it, right? We also see that it's that when the servants, and Luke adds this, when the servants who had been sent to Jesus to ask him to do the healing, when they returned to the house, they found the servant well. And of course, we know from Matthew's account that the servant was healed before these servants ever even left the presence of Jesus to go back, right? So that's how we kind of put those two together. All right. That's the story, okay? So again, the occasion, he's just got done with the Sermon on the Mount, and he's gone back down into Capernaum. Now remember, Capernaum is special for Christ because it's his adopted home, right? Nazareth was his hometown, but Capernaum is where he has put his headquarters at. That's where he spends his time. He goes out from Capernaum. He comes back into Capernaum. That's where he's put himself out. So for his 3 or 3.5 year ministry, Capernaum is his home base, right? Now, Capernaum is later on going to be scolded intensely by Christ. Remember that? Because of all the miracles that he does in Capernaum. And the reason why he had to go up to the Sermon on the Mount to begin with is because of the miracles that he'd done, and all the people that were there in Capernaum wouldn't let him go, right? And in fact, he's going to continue to do feeding of the 5,000. There's going to be a lot of stuff that'll happen around Capernaum and the Sea of Galilee. We're going to see all these miracles, and yet Capernaum will reject him. And so later on, Christ will then condemn Capernaum for their lack of faith, because they've had probably more miracles done in that town or in that local region than anywhere else in all of Israel, right? But Capernaum is important to Christ for a couple different reasons. All right. Now, if we take a look at the centurion, what we note here is he has a military rank, right? So this is a Roman soldier, and he's an officer, right? He's not just a normal foot soldier. He's an officer. He's called a centurion. And the way that the Roman army was designed and laid out is that a Roman legion was 6,000 men. So remember, later on, Jesus is going to cast out a demon. And when he asked, what the name is, what do they say? What the demon says? Legion, right? So in other words, when we get to that, I don't want to spoil it. But in Roman thought, because a legion was 6,000, so yeah, a Roman legion was going to be 6,000 men or 6,000 soldiers. A heliarch was a commander of 1,000 soldiers. So you'd have 6 of them per Roman legion, right? So you kind of think about it, you've got, generals and colonels. I don't know the military, but you got like generals and you got like colonels, and then you got a centurion that might be like I don't know, lieutenant or something like that, whatever. So underneath the heliarch would be a centurion who is a commander over 100 soldiers. So a legion then would have 60 of these centurions, right? But they were leaders, right? These were leaders. And then you had a decurion, which was a commander of the 10 soldiers. MacArthur, in his commentary, he says this. Now, he's actually quoting the Roman historian Polybius when he says this. He says, the Roman historian Polybius describes centurions as, and here's the quote of Polybius, that centurions were not so much venturesome daredevils as natural leaders of a steady and sedate spirit, not so much men who will initiate attacks and open the battle as men who will hold their ground when worsted and hard-pressed and be ready to die at their post. Okay, so we shouldn't get the idea of, I don't know, you see the movie like, Gladiator, or I don't know, what was the other one? The one with the 300. Yeah, something like that, where you just like, one guy's out there, he's taking on like 500 guys on his own, and he's just, they're just get that wasn't them. They were in charge of these 100 soldiers, and they were to be leaders of them and to make sure that they followed, but they also were to encourage them and lead them so that they wouldn't abandon their post. So he's used to having people underneath him. He's used to giving commands, but he's also not a person that's likely given to just, popping off and doing something crazy, right? He's probably well thought out, probably very disciplined individual, right? Okay. Now, we do know that the centurion was a Gentile, right? So he's a Gentile, he's not a Jew. He also, it's highly, highly unlikely that he was of actual Roman descent. Now, remember, in the Roman Empire, Rome conquered many lands. And so there was a lot of people that were not Romans. They didn't have, in Roman society, there was different statuses, right? And you could have freemen and things like that. But you could either be born as a Roman, which gave you certain rights, or you could, if you're a conquered person, there were rights that you could have as well. And they had slaves, and they had these different levels of society. But he's not Roman descent because the Romans didn't actually send centurions to Galilee until 44 AD. So if we take that historical fact to be true, this centurion is there well before 44 AD. Which would mean that he's a centurion, but he's likely a person from one of the conquered nations. We don't know exactly who, but he's a Gentile, but not necessarily a Roman. Okay, we also know that, well, we don't know. It's highly likely, I'll just put it that way, highly likely that this centurion has actually become a convert to Judaism, right? Because of the fact that he built their synagogue, right? And he loves the Jewish people. So while we don't know for sure, it's much more likely than not that this individual was a Gentile convert to Judaism, which is why it leads him to love the Jewish nation, the Jewish people, as well as being willing to spend his own hard-earned cash on building their synagogue, right? Okay, so that's a little bit about who the centurion is. Now we get to what people think is a contradiction, but it's not a contradiction at all. They just don't understand it from a Jewish perspective. Okay, so here's the contradiction. Matthew says that when he entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, Lord, my servant is paralyzed at home, suffering terribly. And he said to him, Jesus, I will come and heal him, right? But the centurion replied, right? So what you have here in Matthew's account is he enters Capernaum, and the centurion comes up to him and asks him to heal his servant. And Jesus talks to the centurion, and they have this communication. But in Luke, we have it where that the centurion, when he heard about Jesus, he did what? He actually sent him the elders of the Jews. So the centurion didn't go. He sent the elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. And then when Jesus interacts, They, who's they? Plead with him earnestly. Well, they is the Jewish elders. Right? So the centurion's not pleading with them earnestly. It's the Jewish elders that are pleading with them. And Jesus went with them. Who's the them? Well, the them is the Jewish elders, right? And when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to say, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I'm not worthy for you to come to my roof. Therefore, I did not presume to come to you. Okay, so clearly the centurion said, I didn't come to you, right? Okay, but say the word and blah, blah, blah. So we have what appears to be a contradiction. Now, again, it's super easy to resolve. It's not a contradiction at all right? Now, how do we look at this? Well, in the Talmud, and this is there's this isn't just the only situation, but here's an example from the Talmud. Again, the Talmud are the Jewish writings made up of the Gemara and the Mishnah. The Mishnah was what was around during the time of Christ. The Mishnah was the rabbinic writings, non-biblical, included all these laws that we've been talking about, but it was their laws and their commentaries on their laws, right? Big, massive books. Like right now, if you wanted to read the Talmud, you'd be here till probably some of us might not make it to the end of it. I mean, it's long, right? It's worse than reading the Encyclopedia Britannica, like, over and over again. Anyway, so this is coming from the Jewish Talmud, and it says, a man's agent is equivalent to himself, and this is a thought that goes throughout the Talmud. So in other words, if I have authority and I send my agent to go do something to negotiate something, to buy something in my name, to make a contract or agreement with somebody, whatever the case might be, that person is working in my name as a sent one. And they have the same authority as I do, and it's as if I am there in my own presence, making the contract and doing what else. And in fact, the term apostles means what?
Chosen by Christ.
Nope. Sent ones. Sent.
Authority.
Well, what's that? Online. Hold on. Online?
Sent ones.
Sent ones. That's right. That's what apostles mean. So the 12 apostles are ones that are sent by whose authority? Jesus. And when he sends them, he even says, you'll do greater things than I will, because you have my what? My authority. Right? And even in Matthew, when Jesus is given the instructions concerning the discipline in the church, he says, hey, look, if you go to somebody and you bring an issue up to them and they refuse, go grab 2 or 3 others and bring them. And if they still refuse, go to the church, because where I am, right? And then you condemn him, because when you condemn the person, who is it that's actually condemning them? Christ. There I am in your midst. You are sent ones who are, in this case, exercising the judgment of Christ on that individual as if Christ himself were exercising judgment. Does that all make sense? So this concept is rampant throughout the New Testament and, in fact, in Jewish thought, that the sent one is as if the sender is there himself. All right, so that's the first thing that we have to get in our brains here. Okay, in Bach, Darrell Bach, in his commentary on Luke, he says it appears likely that Matthew has telescoped, truncated, and simplified the story by making the centurion's representatives equivalent to the centurion himself. So Matthew's just like, he gets rid of all that stuff in the middle. And he just is like, yeah, centurion said this, and the centurion did whatever else. But the reality is, the elders who are emissaries of the centurion are as if the centurion is there himself, right? Okay. So no issues here with actually reconciling Matthew and Luke. Now I'm just going to stop just for a second. I know I'm not supposed to do this. I want to make sure that all made sense, what I just said. So in Matthew's account, when he's interacting with a centurion, he's actually interacting with whom?
The agent.
No.
Or
The elders. That's right. The elders are the emissaries sent by the centurion. And so Matthew's truncating that. And the command, in fact, later on, when the centurion says, hey, look, I'm also a man under authority. When I say go to a soldier, he does what? Goes under my authority. When he comes, he does what? Comes under my authority. Because my soldiers are sent ones and they act under my authority. So even his response to Christ demonstrates that he understands the same concept. I sent these emissaries and they represent me, right? Does that all make sense? So just want to make sure we're all clear. I'll answer a couple quick questions on this. I will break my rule.
One
Yeah.
quick question.
Yeah.
Are there any other points in Luke and or Matthew where there's an apparent contradiction that this same kind of template applies to how Luke told the story versus how Matthew told the story?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think. I don't think so. There aren't a lot of
I'm just curious.
there aren't a lot of apparent contradictions. There are definitely times when one author provides more info than another. I'm trying to think of where that may be the case. Nothing pops to mind. I'm not saying that there
Or
isn't.
anywhere in Testament that there's, I guess I'm just wondering, like, is this something that this kind of template of how you interpret this apparent contradiction, you know, has more than one instance to it?
I can't think of one off the top of my head of that. Yes. Yes. Like,
I studied some law in college.
Yeah.
And the Uniform Commercial Code today holds true that a person who acts on behalf of someone else, their agent is the same as exactly dealing with that person.
Yep.
So by law and today in the United States, the very same thing holds true, and it's primarily because of the Bible.
yeah, and frankly, in a court of law, they would say something like, well, you know, you authorized it or you signed it. And they might be like, well, I didn't actually, I mean, this person, one of my lawyer did it for me and had the interactions or whatever, and I approved it, but they look at you as the same entity that, yeah. And it's that a concept that we actually understand even in our own time. So no conflict there. And I'll have to think about it, but I can't off the top of my head think of another situation where that actually applies, but I will,
Just
yeah, I'll noodle it.
What time period were each of these written to accounts?
Well, it all depends on whether or not you believe Matthew was the first gospel that was written, right? I think there's good evidence that Matthew was the first one. Some claim that Mark was written. Luke would have been written after both of them. There, you know, I think Luke, they were saying is somewhere probably around, if I remember correctly, late 40s AD, maybe early 50s. And Matthew is probably going to be somewhere around maybe the early 40s. So they're not that far from each other, but yeah, it's probably maybe 10, 15, 20 years difference between the writings of those. It's a little hard to, there's lots of different scholars debate on exactly the timing of certain things. Now, John obviously is the later one, and that can be as late as around 90 AD, right? The Gospel of John, after Matthew, Mark, and Luke were already written. Okay, all right, what's the request? Well, we already seen here that Matthew and Luke provide not conflicting information, but complementary information about the state of the servant. So a few things that we learn here is that, you know, Matthew says that he's paralyzed and suffering, right? So those two things put together are, I think, an important indicator that probably the servant has experienced an accident, okay? Because people can get paralyzed, but usually paralyzed means you don't have a lot of feeling, right? That's usually what paralyzes you. This person has been paralyzed and is suffering terribly. Now, when we add into the fact that Luke says he's at the point of death, I think that, now again, we don't know because it doesn't say here, but I think it's very likely that the servant has met with some sort of an accident, is paralyzed, is in incredible pain, and is about ready to die. Now, people can certainly die being paralyzed. I remember like Christopher Reeves, Superman, when he fell over the horse, he was paralyzed for many, many years, and eventually it got to him. So you can survive for a while and still die from being paralyzed. But the situation here does seem to indicate a more acute reason for the potential death, right, than something that has been going on for a longer term. Now, I don't know that it's necessarily important that we understand or that we know whether or not, but I do think it's important that he's at the point of death. So in other words, the earnestness of the centurion is that they don't have much time. Right, it's not someone that's in a wheelchair and Jesus could come back at any time, and whenever you have time, Lord, just come by and swing by and do the healing. Like there's a real need for this because of this situation that's going on here. Okay. The other thing that we know is that the Greek word that is there is one for a servant is a slave, and in fact, we're actually called slaves of Christ. Same type of word that's used for us, right? Now, again, a slave back in that time had different connotations than what we tend to think about it. In this case here, servants probably more likely, but he probably was what we might think of as more indentured, perhaps might have been sold to the centurion by a family member to pay off a debt. I mean, there's lots of different reasons why a young boy might, in this case, be a slave to another person. But for whatever reason, it would not be uncommon in Roman society for this to occur. So he is a slave, but the word that is used there is that he is also a young man or more likely even a boy. So he's probably a very young individual, maybe early teens, likely preteen, but somewhere around there. Like this is not an adult, and we're not told why the centurion has this affection for him. You know why? Oh, okay, the chosen season for. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, we won't take. We won't. No. Mike's just pulling our leg. The Bible doesn't tell us anything. All we know is that for whatever reason, this Roman centurion had a slave, and he had a great affection for him, and it distressed him significantly that in fact he was in this type of situation. Let me hold on to your question. I'm going to try to make sure I stay with my plan here. Don't lose your thought though. Don't lose your thought. All right. Anyway, so that's what we've got, right? Now, what's the request? The request is that these Jewish elders are asked by the centurion to go on their behalf to Christ to request that he heal him. Now, we don't know why he didn't necessarily go to Christ, other than the fact that he says, I don't consider myself worthy, which is an odd statement for him to make. Because at that time, who was the conqueror? The Romans. Like the Jews were the less thans in that society. But this Roman has an understanding of who he is. And of course, he's a lover of Israel. So perhaps he even had an understanding of who they were as God's people, whatever else. But he certainly has an understanding of who he is in relationship to Christ. That's what comes out, right? And so because of that, and this is what he said, I didn't think it was worthy for you to come under my house. That's why he sent the delegation. He did not think it was worthy. He did not like it. It would be, he would feel, you ever have guests that, are coming over and you haven't cleaned your house? You're like that. And you're like, so stay away maybe next week, whatever, like that kind of stuff. Like he does not feel like it would be an honor for Christ to come into his house. Like he himself is not worthy of that type of a thing. So he sends these Jewish leaders to do that, right? To do that on his behalf. Now, the question that we should ask ourselves is this, is why would the Jewish elders do anything for Christ or do anything for the Roman centurion? But the word that's used there is that they came to Jesus and they pleaded with him earnestly. So it's sort of odd because just think about what's happened. Jesus has healed on the Sabbath and they've decided to do what to him? Kill him. So the Jewish leadership wants Jesus dead in the most expedient way possible. They've just had to listen to him give this long Sermon on the Mount where he did nothing but castigate them over and over again. If your righteousness is not greater than that of the Pharisees, you will not see the kingdom, right? And so, like, it's really one of the more bizarre things that we have in the New Testament accounts of the life of Christ. That these people who hate Christ with a passion, who had to listen to him just sit there and rail against them, that they agree to do this. And not only do they agree to do it, but they earnestly plead with Jesus. Like there's almost like this weird time when they come and they're just like, look, man, please, please, please do this. We hate your guts. Please do it. Right? It's just weird. It's just bizarre. Now, the reason why they do that is because at least the two things that are listed down here in Luke says he is worthy to have you do this for him, and two reasons. Number one, he loves our nation. Like this guy was a, what is it, Jewophile? Is that the right way that you would say it? Jewophile? Right? A lover of the Jews. Like he loves Israel. He loves the Jewish people. We don't know exactly why, but he loves our nation. So even though he's one of the conquering Romans that's there, he has treated the Jewish people with kindness and respect. And it says love, like it's more than just him being kind. Like he has demonstrated love towards the Jewish people in at least the Capernaum area. But he is the one who built our synagogue. Now remember, this is the same synagogue that Jesus got done teaching in. Right? He's been teaching in the same synagogue, and it's this guy that's built it. Now, if you've been to the synagogue in Capernaum, I don't know, has anyone been there at all? Been there? No? All right. So when you go, it's very cool. You can see kind of the ruins of that. Some will debate whether or not it's the actual one or whether or not it's a little bit in a different spot. But you can go there right now and you can go see the synagogue, or the ruins of the synagogue that's there in Capernaum. Well, this is a guy that built it. He took his think about the synagogue and how much it would take to build a building like that. So for whatever reason, he loves these people, and to build them a synagogue tells you that he probably loves Judaism and the God of Israel enough to be able to spend cold hard cash in order to be able to do it. And it's not just a philanthropist throwing out money. Because of the love that he has, these people have such an affection for the Roman, for the centurion, that they're willing to go grovel to one of the worst, they're the most hated person right now. Like there's weirdness going on here if you see the situation. But that tells you, what does it tell you? Like this story here, who's the focus of the story? The centurion. Jesus actually, he's there, but Jesus is not the main point of the story. The story is the centurion. What he has done already to love the Jewish people, and then his faith exhibited towards getting the servant healed. Like it's included in here because he is the focal point of that. In fact, the healing of Christ is almost inconsequential. It's like immediately, he healed him immediately. Or when they got home, he was healed. Like it's the story and the setup and the focus of it is on the centurion. All right, so those are kind of the two reasons for that around the centurion. So they go there, they beg and they plead. And Jesus finally says, yeah. I mean, I don't know how long they begged and pleaded with him, but he says yes. Okay. So Jesus comes with them, and Jesus went with them when he was not far from the house. The centurion said, "Friends." So in other words, he's got, if we get the situation here, Jesus in Capernaum, the centurion hears that. He sends a delegation of the elders to Jesus. They talk to him. They explain the situation. Jesus agrees. Okay, I'll go heal him. And he's walking with the elders back towards the centurion's house. The centurion hears Jesus is coming. Jesus is coming. So what does he do? He sends somebody else, whether servants or other people, to catch him before he can get to his house, to say, don't, right? That's what it says here. Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. So he stops him from coming. And then he says, I did not presume to come to you, which means, again, the centurion at this point has not had a face-to-face encounter with Christ. All right. Now, it's interesting that there's two words for worthy here. In the English, we just translate it as worthy, right? And that the first one is what is used of the centurion by the Jewish people, right? And the elders say the centurion is worthy, and this is the word axios. So if you want to, like, I don't know, name your kid or grandkid or something, you just use the word axios, right? It's a great name. It means of something of great weight or worth. So they valued him. It's this idea of riches and treasure, like he was that type of person to them. And so they exalted him and lifted him up and gave him worship. Is what? The word worship is actually just an English way of saying what? Is it, the word is what? Worship is what? Worth. It's applying or designating worth to God. That's what worship is, right? It's worth. And it's come down through English as worship, but that's what it is. So they have exalted him, not saying they worshiped him, but they have exalted this centurion and provided him worth and value and dignity. Now, when the centurion says to Christ, so keep this in mind, the Jewish people have elevated the centurion to say, man, he is like up here. How does the centurion value himself in comparison to Christ? Because the second word for worthy is hekanos. And hekanos means sufficient. So he says, in this case, I'm not sufficient. In other words, the idea there is a level of sufficiency, or there's a level of who I should be in order for you to even be in, or for me to be in your presence. And I'm insufficient of worth and value, Jesus, to even be next to you, to be near you. Does that all make sense? This is a Roman centurion talking to Jesus. The oddity of this, if you just got to get this here, like what is going on is, like, again, really bizarre. The Jewish people in Capernaum have recognized the extreme value and worth of a Gentile Roman centurion because of his love for them and what he has been willing to do for them. How have they valued Christ, particularly the Jewish leadership? They want to kill him. So their evaluation of Jesus, these very elders that go to Jesus, they have said that Jesus is worth death. He's not worth anything. And so the equation is upside down. So the Jewish leadership has a wrong equation. They have elevated a person who, yes, he's been good, but they've elevated him up to here, and they have said Jesus isn't worth anything. And yet the Gentile centurion has done what? He's flipped it. He said, I know that they think I'm this right here. I'm a can of beans and whatever else. Like I'm this really good person. But compared to you, Jesus, I'm nothing. Does that all make sense? Like there's some irony in this story that if you don't catch it, it'll just like pass you by. Because what is going on here is a microcosm of what will happen in the life of Christ as the story plays out, not only in the Gospels, but into Acts and into the epistles. Yes, which is this, that, and I'll get to this here in a moment, it'll come out more strongly here in just a moment, that the Gentiles will be the ones primarily that will recognize the worth and value and person of Jesus as the Messiah, and the Jews will not, right? But also, his attitude is a microcosm of what should be in our lives. Like instead of us sort of exalting a person to a certain position, he has the right idea, which is subjugating himself as not being worthy under the person of Christ. This is a Gentile who recognizes this. It's like shattering, right? That the Jewish people don't, to the extent that this Gentile does. Great. Keep the thought though. I want to get the keep the thought. Okay. All right. So anyway, we've got these two ideas of worthy here. We've got this again, this microcosm of what will happen in the future. Now, we continue on with the healing. When Jesus heard this in Matthew's account, he marveled and said to those who followed him, truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. And Luke says, when Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turning to the crowd that followed him, said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. Now, I just want you to stop just for a second. Who are the multitude that's been following him?
Jews.
Okay, they're Jews. But what has just happened? I'm not talking about the healing. What has happened prior to the centurion, this story?
They weren't Gentiles at the fall. So he's
No.
a Gentile.
No. The crowd is Jews. But where have they followed him from? No. The mountain. Okay. On the mountain, Jesus did what? Gave the sermon on the mount. And there he expressed true righteousness, faith. If he says, if you believe my words, he gave the examples. Remember the 4 examples of the 2 ways. You'll be like a person who builds their house on a rock. And if you don't accept and believe my words, you'll be like the person who builds their house on the sand. So he's talked to them. So he's got his disciples, he's got the crowd, and also the religious leaders that are now part of it. He's now turned to them. And what he has done is these are Jews. And what he said is this, I just gave you a sermon up here about the righteousness that needs to be there for entrance in the kingdom, about believing in me and accepting my words and building your life upon what I have said. Here we have a Gentile who wasn't part of that and probably has not had close contact at all with Christ, but has just merely heard about him from others. And what reaction do we get from the crowds and from the centurion? Like it's just amazing that he turns to these people who he's just given the sermon to. And this is sort of a jab, to be honest with you, a little bit of a jab, because not only included in that crowd are the people that heard the sermon, but are whom specifically? The 12 apostles. So even greater faith does this centurion have than you, like the 12 that I've selected. Now you think about it. John, Andrew had faith, Nathaniel had faith, Philip, right? Like we read early on about the faith and they followed Christ, right? Nathaniel, you know, that he proclaims him as Messiah, as God, you know, after, you know, Christ says, I saw you sitting under the fig tree, right? And yet Jesus turning to the crowd, which would include his disciples, says, none of you have the faith that this guy has. This guy truly, and then the reason why he demonstrates that faith is because he says, look, the centurion says, you don't need to do what? You do not need to come. You don't need to put your hand on me, hand on my servant. You don't need to say anything. Like, by your very word and your command, it's done. Like that level of faith, just say the word and it's done. Right? And so there's a huge contrast going on in the story that you can't miss. And what we take out of the story is, what side of that ledger are we on? Are we on the side of the ledger where we've got all the information, we've got all the knowledge and everything else, but we don't trust, we don't have the faith? Or we're on the other side of the centurion. He's like, look, I know who you are and I accept it and I put my faith in that. I mean, it's super simple, the difference between that. Now, it says here that Jesus is like, look, not even in Israel I found such faith. Now, I want to say something about this. You know, sometimes when you read the biblical stories, there are individuals where you look at it and go, oh, you know what, that person's going to be in the Messianic kingdom. That person's going to be in heaven. Or like, I think it's someone like a Nebuchadnezzar, right? I think it's really strong evidence that Nebuchadnezzar became a believer, even though he was a horrible king at first, right? There are other people that you look at in the scripture and say, you know, I bet you that person is. If you talk about a hill to die on, this guy right here, he's going to be there because he's exhibited what? Faith. And salvation is based off of what? Faith in the revealed knowledge that you have about God. And while he didn't know all about, you know, he probably didn't know a lot of the Old Testament and all the Messianic claims, he knew enough, had heard enough stories to realize who Jesus was and to say, I know you can do it. And he put his faith in it. To the point where Jesus says nobody else has exhibited that kind of faith. So this guy right here, I'm going to put on my list of people that I'm pretty confident that we're going to see. Right? Okay. Now it says Jesus marveled at the man's faith. Now that word marvel there is just this idea of again, just, it's not the strongest word. We had that up on the Sermon on the Mount, where they were amazed at his teaching. Remember that last time? They were like, I mean, it literally, like their heads are exploding with what Jesus has said in the Sermon on the Mount. But it's not the strongest word, but it's still a very strong word where Jesus is just amazed at this person's faith. Now, it's not that Jesus didn't know how this person was going to react. So it's not like Jesus was shocked, like, oh, I thought he was going to do this, and I thought he was going to do X, and he did Y. And that's not what he's talking about. The amazement here is that this person, who's not a Jew, who hasn't had the revealed word of Scripture to him, in this case, the Old Testament, and if he's a convert to Judaism, he's probably been exposed to some of that. But his amazement is that this one who knows so little, this one to whom the covenants and the blessings that Paul talks about were not given to him, exhibits the kind of faith that he has. It's that marvel of that contrast between those two groups. All right. Now, again, tying this back in here, the centurion demonstrates his faith because he recognizes that not only can Jesus heal, but that Jesus has, the main thing he recognizes is that Jesus has authority. Because that's his whole purpose. That's his whole point here is to remark about his authority. He's like, Jesus, you don't have to come because I know that you have authority. And when you say something, it gets done. Just like in the name, he draws the analogy. I myself am also a man who is under authority. I tell my soldiers to go, they go. I tell them to come, they come, right? And so he recognizes what the Jewish people do not recognize, for the most part, is the authority of Christ. That's why this whole section is going to end here with him establishing his authority, is that he's done all that he needs to and all that he can to establish himself as the messianic Messiah of the Jewish people. And yet when we come to the end of the section, the one that has displayed the most recognition of his actual authority in his person is a Gentile. Right? So you can start to see where the story's going, right? Okay. All right, now what Jesus says this after he says that, I tell you the truth that I found this kind of faith in all of Israel, then this is what he says. So he gives a promise and then he gives a condemnation. Okay. And now this is going to tie back to what he said in the Sermon on the Mount. So we just kind of keep the chronology of things going and we just understand what he's already been talking about. This ties in really well. He says this, I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. All right, there's two parts of this. One part is the commendation, and one is the condemnation, right? So when he says many will come from the east and the west, that's a reference to the Gentiles. It's going to be a lot of them coming from the east and from the west. And they're going to do what? They're going to recline at the table with the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Where? In what? In the kingdom. Okay. Now that's actually kingdom of God, but because Matthew is writing to the Jews, he substitutes the word heaven because you're not allowed to write that and to say that, to use God's name. So Matthew says kingdom of heaven, and the other authors typically, not all the time, but many times will say kingdom of God. So here you're going to have, Jesus says, hey, look, you know the righteousness that I talked to you about up on the mountain? You know the righteousness that you had to exceed in order to enter the kingdom, to inherit the kingdom? Remember, he talked about inheriting the kingdom in the Sermon on the Mount, right? Praying for God's kingdom to be done, your will be done on earth as in heaven. These Gentiles now are actually going to be the ones that get to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And to be there with the Messianic kingdom that's promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's the reason why we believe in the resurrection, because they never got to experience what God promised them. God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have not been fulfilled as individuals. So that's why there must be a resurrection for them in the kingdom. Now, the word that he uses here is recline, right? Or sit. Some versions will say sit, but the word there is recline. And that word is indicative of the posture that Jews have when they eat. If you've been to like a traditional Passover service, you'll have seen this. But the Jews, they didn't sit around like tables like this and chairs. They reclined. They had cushions on the floor. They lean on an arm, and so they recline. And so this is a picture of not rest. This is a picture of banqueting, of feasting, of dining, of celebration. Because the Messianic kingdom is full of celebrations, right? It's full. I mean, there's going to be a lot of good eating, a lot of good drinking, lots of good stuff. A lot of good dancing, by the way. The Bible says that, rather be dancing. So, better get the dancing shoes on. But that's what he's saying right here, is that they're going to be eating at this table, this banqueting table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. All right. And it's because of the fact that they recognize Jesus' authority. They recognize who Jesus is, right? They abide by his word. That's how you get into the kingdom, is accepting who Jesus says that he is. And we learned that from the Sermon on the Mount, right? So he's now just repeating what he's already spent quite a bit of time talking about upon the mountain. All right, now the second part of this is, it says, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness, in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, who are the sons of the kingdom? Well, more broadly, the Jews. Because the Messianic kingdom was promised to which group of people? The Jews. The Gentiles get to participate as they come to Israel, to Jerusalem to celebrate. Like Israel becomes the head and not the tail. In the Messianic kingdom, it's reversed from what is today, where Israel's the tail and everyone around the world wants to beat up on him. In the Messianic kingdom, Israel's going to be the center because the king has his throne in Jerusalem. Jerusalem will be the city of the Messiah, the city of God. And Israel as a country will fulfill the promises that God gave to the patriarchs, right? And so the sons of the kingdom are the Jewish people. So Jesus is here that the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into outer darkness, and that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, that doesn't mean obviously that all this is going to happen to all Jews. He is talking though about those who don't recognize his authority, starting with the Pharisaic leaders, and then going down to the crowds who right now are on his side. They're on Jesus' side right now. They love Jesus. Religious leaders hate him, and eventually the religious leaders are going to get the crowd on their side. And Jesus says that those who thought they were going to be there, and that's the whole thing. The sons of the kingdom are those who were promised the kingdom, the ones that think, I can be there. And according to Pharisaic theology, as long as you were a Jew, you got entrance in the kingdom. You have to be righteous. As long as you're a Jew, you got in. That was it. And so now he's going to say, those who think that they get in just because they're the sons of the kingdom, just because you're Jewish, are going to find out that you're wrong. Entrance in the kingdom doesn't come by birth. It comes through faith. That's what it comes through, right? And then he says here now, again, I told you that we were going to do a section on hell coming up here. So we will definitely do that. So I won't get into any of the details now. I'm just going to, because Jesus doesn't provide a lot. But that's what he's talking about here. He's talking about they will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Okay? That's a description that we find later on in Scripture as a reference to hell. Okay? Now, just one thing, just really quickly. When the English versions of the Bible were originally translated, they weren't very careful, and they actually translated the word Hades and Gehinnom as both being hell, when in fact they're not even the same word, they're not in the same place. So some of your English versions, when it talks about hell, are going to use the word hell, and Jesus isn't talking about hell at all. Okay, so just be aware of that. But in this case, he's referring to the Gehinnom, or the valley of Gehinnom. And remember, Gehinnom was where Manasseh sacrificed children, right? To Molech. That's where he and his followers would take their kids. You know, it's the valley that's right there on in the valley right next to the wall in Jerusalem there, where they would sacrifice their kids. And so this became a place that would be a reference to hell. And so that's what's really Jesus saying here, is that if you think that being a Jew is going to get you in, if you don't have faith in me, like the centurion does have here, you're going to wind up in hell or the lake of fire. Hell and the lake of fire are the same place. Hades is not. Okay, and Lack says this in his rabbinic commentary on the New Testament. He says, The sinners in Gehinnom will weep is well known, and then he quotes some of the rabbinic writings that say that the transgressors will cry and make lamentation, the voice of crying and weeping and lamenting in strong pain, the mighty hell full of lamentation. Of course, that's referring to Gentiles, but Jesus is going to say, no, that's not related to just Gentiles. That includes the sons of the kingdom. Okay, that's it for tonight. I'm going to open it up now for any questions that or comments that the group has. Yes.
A really quick question and then a more ponderous one. If we go way back to the second or third slide, there was a historian that was mentioned.
Yeah, Polybius.
Who's that guy?
He's a Roman historian.
Polybius.
Polybius.
Is he like ancient times?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. These are
Like
like Suetonius.
Josephus?
Yeah.
type of-
Josephus, Suetonius,
Okay.
Plutarch. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just curious about that. So my other comment is it possible that, we talked about multitudes, thousands, potentially thousands of people being on the mountain with Jesus, listening to him. And many of them being Jews, that many of them, believed that he was Messiah, but were then bullied by the Pharisees and the leaders of the Jews who were probably threatened. Because if you were just a regular, Jew that, went and heard somebody at the synagogue on Saturday or whatever, you were probably a whole lot more likely to believe that Jesus was the Messiah than if you were one of the leaders who you probably knew you were the one that he was talking about when he was condemning,
Especially
the
when he names
actions.
you.
I mean,
I mean, you didn't have to figure it out. Like he pretty much names them, scribes and Pharisees. He calls them out.
right. But I guess I'm just thinking about it in terms of, look throughout political history throughout time. And it's like people in power tend to abuse that power and subjugate the people, at the bottom. And I'm just curious how that dynamic played out in how many people were converted, how many Jews were converted, or were they then bullied and abused out of believing in Jesus after his death? You know what I mean? Like if you
yeah.
were abusing the justice system, for instance, against your political opponent or something like that. That
Yeah.
same kind of thing.
Well, we don't know during his ministry like numbers, right? We don't know that. We do know that says many turned away from him, and we'll get to that point where there will be some things that Jesus himself will say that will turn people that wanted to be his disciples away, and they stopped following him. So there are lots of indications, and of course, as we progress our way through, by the time Christ is crucified, the religious leaders did have a major impact on the majority of the Jewish people. So that by the time he died and was resurrected, probably the amount of people that actually believed in him as the Messiah was fairly small, especially if they weren't aware of the actual resurrection, like he was just a crucified traitor to the Jewish people. Now, we do know that started in Acts. Remember, the church originally was Jewish, and on Pentecost, you had 3,000 that were saved, and then they were just multiplying day after day as they broke bread and as they met. So after that point, the Jewish numbers grew extensively, and then when the religious leaders started to persecute the church, then of course it spread out to the rest of the world, including the missionary journeys of Paul. And then you started having the Gentiles becoming more prominent. By the time you get to the book of Romans, one of the big issues in the book of Romans is the conflict between Jews and Gentiles within the Church of Christ. Same thing with Galatians, right? So we don't know exact numbers, right? But we do know that it probably declined up till his death. And then with the proclamation of the resurrection and with Pentecost, then we started to see the church expand and grow, and of course, that was Jewish. Yes, Mike, yes.
I'll remember your question. I'll get back to you.
Don't worry, Jeff.
This will just be a quick comment. I'm not trying to teach or anything. I just wanted to say that. Have you ever seen the show Risen?
No.
It's the centurion that saw Christ after he was raised from the dead. Fantastic show. So Risen. It's an Easter show. I wanted to say that I find it absolutely amazing, like you've been talking this whole time, the faith of this Gentile Roman soldier, and the Romans they hated the Jews, parenthetically hated the Jews. But he had enough faith and he knew who Christ was, that he could raise or heal his servant. And that he even had any love for a servant, because servants were easy come, easy go. But then down the road, Jesus comes on Passover, and he's teaching and he's talking, and we all know that he just did the Beatitudes, and they all were just in amazement that this guy was teaching without talking to any rabbis before, or mentioning any rabbis before him. It was all out of his mouth and his authority. But yet at Passover, the Pharisees come up to him and they say to him, "By what authority do you do these things? By what authority do you have this power?"
Yep.
It's like, it's been explained for, the last 3 years. I just find it amazing.
Yeah, and that's part of the that's part of the issue, and that's part of what he's established, is he's got the authority to do that for sure. And we'll figure out why they reject him and why the rest of the for the most part, the rest of the nation will reject him as well.
He touched on what I was find amazing, and I would like your quick take on this. I knew there was at least another centurion who seemed to be a believer, and I couldn't put my finger on it. So I looked up centurion in the back, and there was three. But I find it amazing that beyond this guy who had fully faith that Jesus was who he said he was, then there was Cornelius in Caesarea, who it says he was a believer in God, and along with his whole household, he gave generously to the poor, and he prayed continually to God. And then there was at the cross, once Jesus said it is finished, a centurion is identified as standing there and say, truly, this was the Son of God. And these centurions, Roman centurions, they've seen a lot. They've seen it all. Leaders of men, 100 men at a time, and yet these three guys, all centurions, had this great faith that Jesus was who he said he was. And do you have a take on that, or is that just the power of the Holy Spirit?
Well,
and faith.
I mean, I can't speak to each individual's why they react that way, but I think one of the main reasons is that they're not stuck in Pharisaic Judaism. Like when you're stuck in Pharisaic Judaism, there's all of this stuff that you do, and then when the Pharisees say he's not the one, and then they say he's not the one because of demon possession, right? Then if you are a good Jew and you're following your religious leaders, that's the conclusion you come to. Whereas these Gentiles, they're not under, I mean, other than this guy right here that probably was some convert to Judaism, but at this time, the religious leaders haven't really vocalized their hatred for him, so he probably wouldn't have known any different. These other ones, they don't really have a religious background in Pharisaic Judaism that would prevent a stumbling block. Like today, it's very hard for most Jews to come to Christ because of the religious stumbling block. I think these Gentiles it's probably much easier for them to see past that because they don't have all of that stuff there. They just look at what's going on, and it's much easier to recognize who Christ is.
Saying that we talked about tonight, if he was appreciated, learned about God from the the Jewish teachings, and he was converted to Judaism, that doesn't necessarily mean he got circumcised. There's a word for people who
Well, no,
convert,
I mean,
out, like
so- well, he's a proselyte.
proselyte.
I mean, he would have converted to Judaism, be proselyte. Now, again, I think it's probably likely he was circumcised. Right? If he's a convert to Judaism, you're going to have to do that. That's part of what Paul's talking about in Galatians. Remember, you've got these Judaizers, believers, who are saying, oh, when a Gentile becomes a believer, they got to get circumcised. Otherwise, whatever else. So I don't know. Like, I don't want to get, but it's very, I mean, likely if he was a convert, then yes, that would have been the case right there. All right. Any other comments or questions?
Oh, I got one. And it's not about what we basically talked about tonight, but what I was wondering, when you mentioned that you had been to Capernaum.
Yeah, Capernaum. Yeah.
Capernaum.
Yeah.
So is Capernaum actually located within the town, the main town?
Jerusalem. Oh no, so Jerusalem is in Judah. It's within the tribe of Judah, Judea. Yeah, it's a ways away. Yeah, it's like I think like around a 3-day walk. So it's a ways away.
Yeah.
And Capernaum is at the Sea of Galilee. It's on the northwest side, and the Gadarenes, where he's going to go over, and the guys that demon possessed, they're on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. So Capernaum, Jesus spends a lot of his time around Capernaum, which was at that point a much larger town, an incredibly affluent fishing village with a lot of commerce because of the road that went through there. That's where the Romans established their toll booths. So a lot of commerce came. I mean, like, look, this was like I-5 and the commerce and everything coming through there. It's not like that now. It's just tourist stuff now. But yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and yeah, we'll see you next week. Appreciate it. Any questions online? Yeah, there's quite a few. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We appreciate it.
Yes, you come and see us.
See you next week.